Okay, so here we are. We're going to be talking about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. I'm going to be sort of moving things around on my screen a little bit, so if it gets confusing, just pause and take a break. Here I am. Here's my cursor, but you can hear my voice, and that's pretty much it. So what you're going to want to think about, maybe my finger, maybe you just saw that, I don't know. What we're going to want to think about is how, and I'm going to type this on the bottom, how did these ideas from this period lead to and influence on the decision for the American colonies, that's really well, not worded well, to separate from Great Britain, right? That's ultimately the question. You know, the question that we've been talking about, how and why does the relationship transform between Great Britain and the colonies? The colonies in Great Britain, right? Okay, and that's our big question that we've been talking about for, quite some time. And if you watch this, hopefully this will help you figure that out a little bit. I'm going to start with the Enlightenment, although actually, if you think about it, the scientific revolution predates the Enlightenment, which means it comes before. So the ideas that flourish or come to be widely accepted for the most part during the scientific revolution is what paves the way for the philosophers of the Enlightenment. So major ideals of the Enlightenment are the follows, the universe is fundamentally rational, and this is sort of a major paradigm shift, and you can write that in the bottom here, or you can see me write paradigm shift, right? And a paradigm shift means the following. It is a change in the way that people perceive the world. And there's lots of different examples of this. This is sort of like, for most, I would say most Americans, we recognize that women receiving the right to vote is not some sort of like privilege, but it's a right. But, for most of human history, the idea of women voting was laughable. But over the course of the early 20th century, changes take place for a variety of reasons that lead to the amendment that allows women the right to vote in the United States, and sort of the rest of the world follows suit. But the Enlightenment is kind of an example of that. So before the Enlightenment, before the scientific revolution, people understand the world in a completely different way than you or I do. We live in a post-Enlightenment world. We are a product of the Enlightenment. We do not look to, for the most part, I would argue, that we do not look to superstition or not always, but sort of maybe religious ideals to explain the world around us. Although obviously some people do, but the idea that you have the right to do that, whether or not you are religious or not, is an Enlightenment idea. And there are a bunch of philosophers who make these ideas very popular. But again, just to be clear, the Enlightenment itself is a movement that is dominated by the wealthy and the elite. Because if you have enough time to sit around and think about all of these like incredibly thoughtful ideas, you clearly have enough money to not be working in the fields or doing any other kind of menial labor. So people like John Locke and people like Voltaire are extremely wealthy and are highly educated and have the free time the leisure time to come up with these ideas. So one of the ways in which we think the Enlightenment changes the world is that it redefines the relationship between people and their government and other human beings. The scientific revolution is more about how human beings interact with the natural world. We talked about the Magna Carta in class in terms of English political precedents, but the Magna Carta is not obviously a part of the Enlightenment period, but it paves the way. It sets political precedents for England, who is a major part of the Enlightenment, to think about the relationship between people and their government. So the idea is the following. The Magna Carta is a document that is foisted or forced upon King John by the very, very wealthy barons who are landowners in England in the 13th century. And they say, if you want to raise taxes, you need to have us vote on it. You can't just decide unilaterally or on your own. So it's a political document that sets the precedent or the tradition that a monarch has limited powers and that a legislative body or a body of people can make decisions for themselves. I would argue that the Magna Carta is one of these like really seminal English documents that paves the way for people like John Locke thinking about there being a contract between the people and the government, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau thinking about a contract and the people. Okay. Here's John Locke. John Locke is pretty awesome. John Locke is one of the earlier, he's on the early side of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment tends to be thought of as an 18th century movement, but more towards the mid to late 18th century, just because the Enlightenment begins in Europe, and it begins primarily in places like France and England and Germany and Italy. It does eventually obviously take root in America. The ideas of John Locke directly influence people like Thomas Jefferson. I wanted to go back and say that. Sorry. We're going back to the Magna Carta really quickly. Isn't this fun? So the Magna Carta really quickly limits the power of an executive or an authority, and that's the same kind of idea that Thomas Jefferson says. Thomas Jefferson very famously said, a government should fear its people. Right? People should not fear the government. And that's an Enlightenment thought, right? And it's inspired by things like the Magna Carta, but it's also inspired by people like John Locke, where it says legislators owe their power to a contract with the people. Let me fix that right there, right? And kings, and the idea was at this point, like everyone saw kings as like powerful in their own right because they were given power by God, but that's not necessarily the case, argues John Locke. And John Locke believes in something called the tabula rasa. I'll write that right here. And a tabula rasa means a blank slate. And he believes that human beings, when they are born, are affected by their environment. So that you are born a blank slate and that you are changed by your environment. So it's like nature versus nurture. And so he would be all about nurture. Like if you can change your environment, if you can make changes to that environment that allow for people to have access to education, then you are going to change the world itself. People themselves are not inherently bad. It is the world in which they come into that make them bad. That's what winds up happening. So in order to make sure that the government respects the rights of the people, right? If legislators or lawmakers owe their power to a contract with the people, then you need to enshrine that or make sure that that's written down in a list of rights. So the English Bill of Rights is a little bit before the Enlightenment, but it's a result of the Glorious Revolution, which again you read about in your American Revolution Part 1 reading, right? The Glorious Revolution is the removal of King James, and William and Mary become monarchs, and it's a peaceful transition of power. And what it does is it strengthens the power of Parliament and reduces the power of the monarch. And so if you think about the American Revolution, which is basically the American colonists say that Great Britain does not have the right to dictate to them, whether or not you believe that's driven by economic motives or not, politically they get their ideas from the English Bill of Rights. So our Bill of Rights, that is essentially the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, is almost in some ways verbatim to the English Bill of Rights. So when you see things like no excessive or cruel punishment, freedom of speech, these are ideas that have become enshrined in American thinking, and we go into more depth about what that means, like freedom of speech, later on this year. We talk about what does that mean? What is freedom of speech? And there are limits on these things, right? And the limits on free speech have changed over time. So here are some major thinkers besides John Locke. So John Locke's really important, but one of the most important are people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And that's why you're doing your Facebook pages. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau obviously knows more about Jean-Jacques Rousseau than anyone else. He believes that the government, and you read about this too for homework, right? He believes that the government can be really dangerous and that an unlawful government can produce a really bad situation. So if you believe that there's a contract or an agreement between the people and the government, and the people are not upholding their end of the contract, then they can get rid of it. Well, That's an idea that Jean-Jacques Rousseau puts forth. Voltaire is actually, well, he's my favorite, personally. He says things like, I might not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, which is more about principle rather than like the exercise of that principle. So I might not agree with what a lot of people, sort of politicians say, but I believe that they should be able to say it. And he is really a trendsetter in that he says that the religious wars that have been dominating Europe for the past 100 years, because Catholics and Protestants have been fighting, like murdering each other, doing all sorts of terrible, god-awful, gross things to each other. He's like, we need to be more tolerant. And so the age of the Enlightenment is also known as the age of toleration, which is not something necessarily that we need to worry about for the American Revolution, because the American Revolution, although does obviously have ties to religious beliefs, we're not focusing on that. We're really focusing more on the cultural identity, economic and political peace. And like, if you want to think about political factors that contribute to the revolution, you're thinking about things like the American colonists believing that they are a product of English history, product of English political ideas, and you also have them reading and writing and responding to and absorbing the ideas of people in Europe during this Enlightenment period. So Ben Franklin is, like a contemporary of Voltaire. Like, they're living at the same time. So, for example, like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and John Adams are considered Enlightenment thinkers. They just happen to be in America. Montesquieu is really important, but not so much in terms of the decision to separate from Great Britain in 1776. His understanding of what a government should look like basically forms the basis of our government today. So you have separate branches of the government. You have the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branch. But what he says, and I love this quote, to become truly great, one has to stand with people, not above them. And I think that that's like a great life quote. You can't rule just with authority. You have to, give reason for that authority. You have to give people the sense that you're in it with them. And he actually argues that England has the best system of government when he's writing. But he directly inspires people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who are leaders in creating the government in the 1780s. César, also important in terms of, impacting the Bill of Rights. So not necessarily directly instrumental in leading to the decision to break from Great Britain, but that's more people like Voltaire and Rousseau and John Locke. But César Beccaria does form the backbone of our Eighth Amendment, which is the amendment that prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, which obviously we can get into what does that mean? What is unusual? What is cruel? But he says punishment should be just, not vengeful, which is an amazing idea in and of itself, because I think that most human beings are probably more concerned with vengeance than they would like to admit. But he's more concerned with the ideals of justice and fairness, and that if you have a government that is going to execute or torture its citizens, then the government has lost all of its authority. Like, watch V for Vendetta. That's kind of like the whole point there. So these are the American philosophes, right? When the philosophes is that French term that's used to describe a thinker of the American of the time period of the Enlightenment, excuse me. And so you have John Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. We talk a lot about these guys in the upcoming weeks, so I don't want to belabor the point, but they are important for a variety of reasons. But these men are the leaders of the independence movement, most specifically people like Franklin and Adams. Jefferson is kind of quiet during the convention to sort of figure out if they're going to declare independence. He does obviously write. He's a contributing writer to the Declaration of Independence, but it's people like John Adams and Ben Franklin who really spell out a lot of the reasons as to why Great Britain should be not defeated, but like why the colonies should separate. Finally, you have Thomas Paine, and if you can see this, it says common sense. I'll just make that. Let's see. Let's change that color there. Make it red. Oh, there. That's so much better. Okay, so he writes these two things. He's most famous for common sense, but he also talks, and he also writes this really beautiful and eloquent piece of writing during the American Revolution, which Washington quotes to his troops, and he says very famously, "These are the times that try men's souls." Like, it's really easy to go into battle and it seems fun, but when things are bad, that's when you really need to like come together as a group. But we're going to look at common sense in much more detail. Common sense is a tract or a piece of writing that argues just that. It's common sense for the American colonies to separate from Great Britain. And a lot of those arguments he gets from, the ideas of reason and rationality. So again, this is not a lecture about the scientific revolution. I'll do a separate one for the scientific revolution in a moment, but I'm going to have you'll watch this one probably second, so I'll have you watch scientific revolution one first and then this one. All right. So this is like the big idea. This is what we're going to be doing, by the way, on Friday, and then maybe even a little bit probably next week. So when we're talking about your essay, again, so we have our three factors. We have economic factors that contribute. We have cultural identity. And then we have these political ideologies or beliefs. The political beliefs are two things. The first thing, political beliefs, is, the historical precedents set by the English, like the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, and the Glorious Revolution. Those ideas definitely shape and transform the relationship because American colonists see themselves as a product or entitled to these things, right? A part of that. The second is, just as important, are Enlightenment ideals. Enlightenment ideals, that's B. So you have two sort of parts of this. Enlightenment ideals fundamentally contribute to the decision contribute to the transformation of their relationship, where the American colonists cast themselves as people who have the right to overturn a government, because when a government becomes destructive to the ends in which it was implemented, to uphold, then it needs to be done away with. That idea is an Enlightenment idea. It's actually from John Locke, and then Thomas Jefferson just kind of like takes it. So we're going to be looking in more detail about what about Locke, what about Voltaire, what about Rousseau, what about Thomas Paine? Like, what are all these guys saying that inspire the American Revolution? And so what we're going to do when we come back together as a class is, after you've watched this and you've done your Facebook page, is think about what do these people think, and how does what they think make the relationship different. So it moves from a positive relationship, one that is seemingly mutually beneficial, right? Colonies act as a source of resources, raw materials for the Great Britain. Great Britain protects them and gets the resources back. They have a market, right? And the mother country is always, in charge, and the colonies are not. So this changes, right? And it doesn't change in like 13 years lickety-split. It changes over time, and part of the reason it changes over time, in large part, to why it changes over time, are these Enlightenment ideals. And the Enlightenment, I would argue, was not possible. It's not possible. I don't think anyone would be like, oh, that's an argument. The Enlightenment is not possible without the advancements made during the scientific revolution, which are a complete overturning of the way that people understand the world.